Okay, so I'm titling this Money, Money, Money. I won't finish the rest of the song. Just a little background on what Scripture says about money and wealth. For example, in Genesis, it says Abram was described as a man of great wealth in terms of livestock and silver and gold. Joseph's brothers sold him for 20 shekels of silver, which was an added bonus in getting rid of an annoying brother. Solomon was so wealthy that silver was not considered of any value in his day. There was so much gold in Jerusalem that silver was basically considered worthless. Some observations on money from Proverbs. Just see what this proverb teaches a little bit about money and wealth. Proverbs shows us that there is no great virtue in being poor. The poor have hardships that the rich avoid. For example, in Proverbs 10:15, it says, "The rich man's wealth is his fortress. The ruin of the poor is their poverty." So it's under no illusion that poverty is not very good. Proverbs 14:20 says, "The poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many." Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave." If any of you have ever taken out a big mortgage, you'll realize how true that is. Now, typically, Proverbs teaches that hard work generally brings financial reward. Proverbs 10:4 says, "Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." So generally, labor does bring a certain amount of, as I say, financial stability, but it's not always the cause of poverty. It's probably not always the consequence of laziness or folly. Proverbs 13:23 says, "Abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it is swept away by injustice." So in those days, fallow ground was left for the poor to harvest, but sometimes landowners basically took everything out of the land and left nothing for the poor. Generosity is something that brings a reward. Proverbs 11:24 says, "There is one who scatters yet increases all the more, and there is one who withholds what is justly due, but it results only in want." So it's a general principle is those who are generous to others will find others will be generous to them in return, and those who are mean to others, they'll find they'll get the same back. Now, again, Proverbs warns us that pursuit of money is not everything. Proverbs 15:17 says, "Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox and hatred with it." And 17:1 is similar. "Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife." So again, each of those gives a perspective on money or wealth, and it says sometimes you're better off to be poor and to have love or quietness than to be rich and to have hatred or strife. Proverbs 23:4-5 says, "Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings, like an eagle that flies towards the heavens." And it's the idea that wealth never really stays with you. Wealth can as easily leave you as you work hard to gain it, and then it just leaves you. People have lost investments literally overnight. So again, Proverbs has a balance that while wealth will protect you from poverty, it's not something that you can ultimately depend upon. And so you have to learn to depend ultimately on God. The New Testament, I just looked at these two verses here. Kingdom values are to trust in God for daily provision and not to be anxious like the Gentiles, knowing that God is the ultimate provider. So ultimately, trust in wealth is actually trust in God who provides. The early Christians in Jerusalem did not consider that anything belonged to them, but sold their possessions and shared their wealth freely. Interesting, they took a very different view of wealth than we would today, and they just considered wealth as a means of blessing others, and it was a privilege to give. So let's give just a background of what Scripture teaches about wealth and money and poverty. Well, let's look at money in our secular culture, the culture in which we live in. And again, these are just statements around what our culture says about money. Again, they're not necessarily always true for everyone, but they're there in the culture. In general, the secular culture admires and values wealth. Wealth is seen as the reward for hard work and the application of education and business acumen. So basically, if you work hard and you're educated and you take the breaks that come, you should get the reward of some financial reward. Success and achievement in the workplace is promoted as a high value, often above that of moral character or integrity in business. Often people get promoted in certain places. It's not because they've always had integrity. It doesn't always work that way. But often they're still looked up to. People draw security from owning their own homes, having a stable and well-paid career. Successful people will put more time and effort into the pursuit of a career to the detriment of their own families. So often, to succeed in business or to succeed in work, there's often a price to be paid, and that can be in the home life, can pay the price. Even those on reasonable income can suffer from financial insecurity. The fear of losing one's income, of becoming poor, can cause anxiety in many people. Many feel a sense of shame or failure if they can't maintain a lifestyle comparable with their closest friends. So in the secular world, people also suffer this anxiety and fear that they will either lose their income or won't be able to keep up with others. Okay, continuing on that theme of our secular society. For some, their sense of worth is tied up in having the latest iPhone or coolest runners, and they can be devastated when times get tough financially and they can't afford these. Some people they tie their self-being a lot to their money. For those on lower or no income, or those with disability, they face the constant insecurity that poverty brings. They find it difficult to maintain stability and lack the resources to provide for their families. They are often trapped in the dilemma of working long hours in low-paid employment that prevents them accessing better education that would lead them out of poverty. I'm making a statement because I don't want there to be any illusion that poverty somehow is okay. And for those with disability or very low incomes, they live in the world of poverty all of the time. And that is not very good. For others, they can cope with being poor themselves, but cannot bear to see their children being deprived or having less possessions than their peers. They will often go into debt to buy expensive things for their children to shield them from poverty. And this is another side effect of poverty, is that families will go into literally debt so their children don't look poor. And now the question is, how can we as Christians engage with the secular world? If this is the way the secular world sees money, and if this is sometimes the reality they live in, how do we engage with that? I'm saying here, before we can engage with the secular world concerning perspectives on money, we must first confront our own inner perspective. People don't want to lecture on money. They want to talk to real people about it, people who have confronted their own fears and dysfunctional relationship with money. Christians can struggle with money and possessions in just the same way as their secular neighbours. Often Christians can pretend that money, or lack of, does not bother them. They say outwardly that things are fine and that they are trusting the Lord with their finances, but inwardly they are anxious and spend restless nights worrying about it. And I have met believers who I know on the side are really anxious, but they're afraid to admit to it because they think it's unspiritual to admit that they are anxious or worried or concerned about finances. Often Christians say they're content with their financial situation, but inwardly they struggle with jealousy when they see others doing better than them. Christian couples argue over money and often perceive their spouse as being more financially irresponsible than them. I had that a while back when I met with a group of people, and that was a common thing coming out from different spouses, saying that their own spouse was irresponsible. Until we come to terms with our own relationship with money, we really have nothing to engage the secular world with. When we get our own hearts in order, then we will truly have something worth sharing. So my point here is that we have to come to terms with our own thinking around money, around wealth, around poverty, around work, and that balance between work and living life. We have to come to terms with that ourselves. And often I think we can fool ourselves if we think that applying a couple of, I call it, spiritual verses onto what we truly believe is going to work. I think we need a real deep conversation with God about what we feel about money so we can get to the root causes of maybe some of our insecurities or some of our issues around money. In that context of us really dealing with this, I've put here a number of questions we can ask ourselves. So I'm setting these a number of questions I think it's worth asking ourselves. And again, some of these will apply to you, some of these won't. Some you already have worked through, and some of them maybe might be new to you. But I think these are worth thinking about and considering as we look at this issue of money. So let me just look at some of these questions that are here. One is it relates to our background. What value system did your parents hold regarding money and career? Did your parents worry and fight over money? Are your parents happy with you and proud of your financial achievements? What part of their value system did you internalize and bring into your adult life? So it's really asking you to look at your family story. Where have you come from in terms of money? So, for example, my grandfather was an absolute alcoholic. He lived on a farm, obviously with my father and my father's siblings, and he drank the farm to nothing. My father had to leave school at 14 to work for another farmer in order to literally put money on the table. As a result of that, my father was, I think, terrified of ever becoming financially poor. And so he never went near a pub, but he also worked literally night and day. He worked very, very hard in order to turn the farm back into a management farm. And to his credit, he gave us as a family a reasonably good living. You know, we were not poor, but we certainly weren't well off in any way. We just had enough. And he gave us a value system of working really hard and being very financially prudent. My mother, on her side, her mother died when she was quite young, and her father was very old and very, very rich. And my mother, in fact, by marrying my father, married into a very poor family. And so while my mother was poor for the first couple of years of their marriage, she always pretended she was better off. She hated if we ever talked about how many cattle we had on the farm or what her income was like. She was terrified that people would see her as poor. And she pretty much lived most of her life in fear of losing the farm. Financial security to her was a constant worry. And I see that passed on to some of the next generation in my background. So that's my background, and I've had to kind of figure out, where do I find a balance? Because it certainly wasn't there in my own background. The second thing is what goes on in our home. Do you feel that you and your spouse are on the same page financially? Do you feel comfortable talking about and making tough financial choices as a family? Have you ever felt a failure or guilty because you cannot give your children the things that you see their peers having? Do you worry when it looks like you might not have enough earnings to meet your future expenses? Have you ever blamed your family discontent on your lack of finances? Again, these are all tough questions of how do you balance family and money, and how do you effectively rear a family and with the finances that you have coming in. Again, to get more deeply into our own thinking, right? What do you tell yourself about people who are like you in talent but have succeeded financially better than you? Do you tell yourself that they were lucky? Are you jealous of them? Do you find it hard? Like, what do you truly tell yourself? Do you believe that if you had more money, you would be less anxious? Have you ever taken the option of blowing money on treats or frivolous purchases when you know deep down that you can't afford it? Have you felt guilty or ashamed when you can't afford to do the things that your friends are enjoying? And with all these have to do with how comfortable internally you feel about the financial situation you're in. And learning to be honest in it is a large part of this. Have you ever felt guilty about spending money on yourself? Do you think you're worthy of maybe spending something on yourself occasionally? Have you ever asked yourself what inner needs you're trying to meet when you engage in retail therapy? Have you ever lied to others when you were struggling financially and told them you were fine? Have you ever argued with God about the unfairness of your financial situation? And this one here, I think is good. I think it is actually very, very healthy to have that conversation with God, to have that argument with God, but resolve it. Work until it's resolved. It's like, it doesn't work to bear a grudge against God about your situation, nor does it work to tell God all is fine when in your heart of hearts you are fuming because you don't have the finances you think you need. Have the conversation, have the argument, but come out the far side of it. Have you ever resented other believers and felt that God blessed them financially more than he did you? So do you play the comparison game and then a bit of the self-pity game that why are other believers blessed and you're not? Have you ever been truly honest with yourself or confided in one other person about your struggle with money? Ever had those conversations? When I was 34, I was out of work. I had no money. I was recently separated from my wife, and I was trying to take care of a 1-year-old child. It took me 9 months to find my first job back in an engineering firm, which is what I'm qualified in. And at 34 years of age, the only job I could get was one where they offered me a graduate salary. So I was on the same salary as a 21-year-old. 3 years later, I became redundant from that job and ended up again with another engineering company that again offered me a graduate's position, even though I was now 38 years of age and I'd qualified 16 years before. I know what it's like to be in places where you think it's really, really difficult financially. I know what it's like to have nothing and yet to have responsibilities, that you have a child to rear. You can't just live off nothing. And I know what it's like to have those conversations with God around, is this fair and will I make it through? And I can say that in all of it, God gave me breaks. Yes, I had to work hard. My first job, I worked 65 hours a week in order to put down a deposit for a house. Choices often weren't easy. But the thing that I really worked hard over the years was not letting it interfere with my relationship with God, and not keeping God out of what I really felt. Sometimes it takes courage to be honest and not to pretend. And it's only when we do that, it's only when we get to that far side of having gone through it, do we actually have anything to say to the secular world.